I'm going to share some tips on receiving feedback. Hi, I'm Cecilia Gorman. I'm the creator of Manager Bootcamp. I help managers of all levels feel more equipped to communicate with, motivate, and lead their teams. Think of your career journey like sailing in a sailboat. If you've ever been in a Sabot or some kind of small sailboat, you know that in order to go straight, you're actually not holding the rudder straight the whole time. In a sailboat, holding the rudder perfectly straight would probably crash you into something quite quickly. Sailing is a series of slight adjustments. In order to go straight, you're course correcting a little left, a little right the entire time. The same holds true for your career. It's never a straight shot. We too are course correcting the entire time. No one goes straight, full speed ahead without some adjustments, constant adjustment. And these adjustments you'll make in your career often come by way of feedback from other people. In turn, you're going to adjust a little left, a little right. Your best self is going to come by way of feedback from other people. Your employee's best self is going to come by way of feedback and feedback from you and from the other people that they work with. So repeat after me. My best self comes via feedback. My best self comes via feedback. We've got to start to get comfortable with this idea because most people, well, they really don't like getting feedback. And maybe you're one of them. And if we aren't getting the feedback that we need, if we aren't course correcting and making slight adjustments to our game, we run the risk of being off course in our career. Receiving feedback is a tricky thing, isn't it? If you ask the average employee, hey, how fun is it to get feedback at work? 9 out of 10 times you're going to hear, yeah, not so much. See, our brains are complex processors. When we get in a stressful or anxious situation, which might happen when we receive feedback, our stress hormones start to kick in, and it sets off a series of reactions in our body that compromise our ability to think straight. Emotional hijack takes over, and we start to lose the capacity to think and talk rationally. Feedback conversations have the capacity to trigger us, and it makes it harder for our brain to operate. So here's a few things about receivers of feedback that are helpful to understand. First, when somebody receives feedback that triggers them, that they don't like or understand, they may start to shut down. And you'll know you've triggered a shutdown when the person physically and verbally starts retreating. When you say something I don't like, I cross my arms, I purse my lips, I stop being part of the conversation. At all costs in a tough conversation, we are working to avoid shutdown. So next, receivers of feedback, they're human beings. And for that reason, like all humans on the planet, there's a need to be liked just the way they are. So giving feedback means that there's something that's not working, that there's a behavior that needs to be improved, and there can be a sensitivity around that we need to be conscious of. People want to be liked just the way they are. Finally, understand that receivers of feedback, they enter that conversation just a little bit on edge. They might be anxious or nervous, which can add to the emotional dynamic in the room. I know for me, when I would get that meeting notice that said annual review, there'd be a little tinge of the unknown in my stomach. Was it going to be bad? Was it going to be good? And you'd have no idea what your boss was going to tell you, and this can make people nervous. Be conscious of the underlying anxiety or stress that goes along with feedback conversations. So if you remember this one thing about receiving feedback, it will shift how far and fast you grow in your career. Every human interaction is a chance for you to get feedback. Every bit of feedback you get is your opportunity to improve or do something different or better because of what you heard. The goal is always to develop you to be the best you can be. Not half best, not sometimes best, not every other Tuesday best, your best self. And how do you do that? Well, by learning how to receive feedback in a productive way, by being open to improvement, by digesting and putting that feedback you get to use. This is not a skill you learn in a 2-hour seminar. This is not one and done. This is a lifelong skill. Receiving feedback is a learned process. It's part of your growth that we're working on our entire lives. Listen, the number one skill of CEOs is a heightened sense of self-awareness. Self-awareness involves asking for input and putting that input to use. If you don't ever want to be in the middle of a tough conversation, if you don't ever want to hear feedback, you're saying, I've got nothing more to learn. Imagine an Olympian, somebody at their top of their game, going to the Olympics, turning and telling their coach, hey, coach, you know what? I got it. I can go to the Olympics without you. Oh my gosh. We need that feedback at every level of our game, and especially so as we get to be more and more equipped. So here's some tips for receivers of feedback. Number one, be confident. Just be confident in yourself, in your skills, in your performance, in what you bring to the table. Anytime we have insecurity in a conversation, sometimes it comes from insecurity about ourselves. Be confident that you were hired for a reason. Be confident that you're a valuable asset to the team. And if you walk in with that confidence, then just know that any tough conversation is merely a means to help you get even better. Next tip is to be curious. Just be curious about what might happen in that room. Be curious about what might be said, and especially be curious about how this feedback could help you grow. Always aspire to a better future self, and see that process, see that conversation as something that's needed to improve, and make that one of your number one goals. Be curious about your potential. The next tip is to ask questions and get things clarified. I can remember one time I went into a performance review, and the first thing that my boss said was, hey, Cecilia, your team, they're good, they're not great. And I didn't really understand what he said, but he continued talking and giving me the rest of the review while I sat there and stewed over this first sentence. I didn't ask any questions about it. I didn't ask him to clarify. Always make sure you're getting the information that you need. Always make sure hey, I'm not quite sure I'm in agreement with that sentence. Can you help me understand what made you say that? Ask a question, get to the root of it. Your time in that conversation is to make sure that you truly are understanding the conversation at hand. The last thing we want out of a performance conversation is for someone to walk out the door and not be clear on what was discussed. The next tip for receiving feedback is to do your best to stay in the conversation. Mentally stay in the conversation. Physically, if you feel you've been triggered and you start to shut down, do your best to counter it. Sometimes we can do that by taking a breath. Sometimes we can do that by asking for a short break. Hey, listen, I know this conversation is important. I feel myself getting a little bit upset. Do you mind if we time out and we regroup this afternoon or tomorrow? Stay in the conversation. Once your stress hormones start to rise and your prefrontal cortex, remember, which is the place where you think and speak clearly from, once that's compromised, it's tough to have a productive conversation. If you feel triggered, ask for a reschedule. If you feel overwhelmed, try taking notes. If you feel emotional, you can ask to be excused. You staying in the conversation is important. You understanding and hearing what's being said is especially important. Make sure you're doing your best to learn how to receive feedback properly, and you'll see things change.